listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. I am joined today by Ben Mathis. Ben is the Chief Content Officer at Airwave. Ben, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just so excited to have you on the show today and learn a little bit about your history and your journey in the podcast space. I know we've known each other for a couple of years now, but I don't think I've ever heard kind of your backstory. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into podcasting?
Sure. I originally come from the film and television background. I, worked for Warner Brothers in production for a number of years, and then at Disney, and then had my own production company at Warner Brothers for a number of years. And podcasting really, it just started out as an interest and a hobby. At a certain point, I found myself listening to podcasts instead of music every time I go for a walk. When I'm in the car, when I'm doing anything, I would try and find an opportunity to listen to a podcast. And I was probably listening to 30 podcasts a week. Even today, I probably listen to 20. But yeah, I was just a podcast fanatic. And it was fairly early on when podcasts were just really starting to catch on, about 15 years ago, I guess. And at a certain point, I just said to myself, there's so many people in this business who just started it purely for fun, just started a show for fun because they had a passion for a subject. And I thought to myself, you know what? It would be fun to try. What a great hobby. What a great way to stay out of trouble. If I just, had this excuse to interview people that fascinate me on a regular basis. And it became a real blessing for me. I launched my own podcast and it took off. And eventually I was getting all these fantastic guests, secretaries of state and scientists and Pulitzer Prize winners and Nobel Prize winners and actors and directors. And I just loved having that excuse to pick the brain of someone that fascinates me for an hour, to be able to sit down and talk to Madeleine Albright for an hour. What other opportunity would I have to have that much time with one person, just asking them questions? So I really fell in love with podcasting. And then at a certain point along the way, many people had been encouraging me to launch a network, and I had always resisted. And then my wife said, look, go ahead and do it. Do the part that you like, and I will handle the business and the legal side and all the stuff that you don't like about it. And you just deal with podcasters, which I love. I really enjoy working with podcasters. I enjoy the back and forth, the brainstorming, everything about it.
That's awesome. So I guess I'm really curious. So many people out there just really love film and TV, and that's their dream, is to get into the film and TV space. How has that worked for you? Do you miss being in that industry?
Not really.
Yeah,
It's just,
I appreciate that answer.
when I look at all of my friends in the industry right now who are dealing with so many changes industry wide with streaming and everything else, it was always a difficult business to be in. You would be developing a project for a dozen years and maybe it would get made into a movie or maybe it wouldn't. Now, we had a brief period where streaming wise, there was just a huge desire for content and that was
Sure.
great. But now they're all cutting back and there's a winnowing effect taking place. And it's just a very difficult industry, I think, right now for anyone. So I don't miss it. I can see a point where maybe we get back into TV and film as streamers and so forth look at podcast content for television and film. But there were so many barriers to entry, and which is sometimes a good thing. I think certainly some people are realizing that in the podcast space. But you deal with executive changeover every year, if you're lucky, sometimes sooner, and different priorities shift. And suddenly the project that you poured your heart into isn't very important anymore. I think the thing that I love about podcasting, even still today, is, the film industry is so gigantic and there are so many stakeholders and different voices involved in making any kind of a decision. Podcasting, when I first got into it, still felt like the silent movie days. Like we were all kind of a bunch of amateurs jumping into this business and
Yeah.
figuring it out. And
Yeah.
yes, there's been some maturation, but I still kind of feel like that about this business. It's an exciting time.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. No, and I think that that's why it's so much fun to be part of the industry, is because it does on a regular basis feel like we are creating this industry And it's neat to be part of something that is growing and that you're building and that you can contribute to in a high level. Obviously, I don't think I've ever heard anyone compare it to the silent movie days, but that is such a fun way to look at it, right? I mean, obviously, TV and film have been around for so many years, and it's as you said, going through so many changes, but it's also really difficult to have a significant impact in an industry that's already so well established. And I think that that's the fun part of podcasting, is that we each have the ability to be really significant contributors.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are still people who are starting podcasts who are brand new to it and just
Hmm.
have a passion for a subject or a great idea, and they can still take off. Now it's getting harder and harder, certainly as we have so many podcasts out there and larger stakeholders, networks, and so on that tend to spend a lot on marketing and tend to dominate the Apple charts and the
Hmm.
Spotify charts. I think it's getting harder for those independent podcasters to launch successfully, even networks to launch successfully. But it's still a pretty exciting time, I think, with a lot of potential.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So tell us a little bit about Airwave. I know that when I think of Airwave, honestly, I think of history podcasts. I know you guys have a nice selection of those shows, but tell us about your network and kind of the content that you have and maybe what sets you apart a little bit.
From the outset, we always said that we want to be the network for the kind of listener who is constantly curious and believes that learning and self-improvement never ends. And we
Mm,
define that fairly broadly. I like to say that we like entertainment that's interesting and entertaining, but also has some kind of nutritional value, however you want to define that. History is certainly a big component of our roster. Part of that is because I'm personally a big history nut, always have been. I love history, and I think history makes for great podcasts. Narrative history is a fantastic space, and there's some really great creative thinkers out there. But we also operate in science, culture, the arts,
mhm.
finance and business is very big for us as well, health and wellness, kids as well. And a lot of times the kids podcasts that we do tend to overlap with other categories that we're in the adult space, whether it's science or history.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That's great. It's neat to hear that, and I really love that perspective in terms of the positioning of your content. And I guess from an advertiser perspective, why is it important for advertisers to think about the type of content that they're advertising on?
Well, I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I think a lot of advertisers tend to think purely in terms of the demographics they're trying to target.
Mhm,
And if this show hits that right demographic, then they think it's a perfect fit. But I do think that content also matters. Yeah, someone who listens to a history podcast may not be the best, even though demographics may align, it might not be the best audience for a reality TV show. I don't know, for lack of a
mhm.
better example. I don't think everything boils down purely to just demographics. And it seems that the industry tends to think purely in terms of demographics a lot of times. And sometimes advertisers perhaps miss out if that's all they're focusing on. There may be content alignments that make a lot of sense for a particular product, but gets left off an advertising proposal because they just say, come to us with X demographic. People who
Mhm.
want females 35 to 45 in rural the United States, the Midwest, something like that. I definitely think content should be a consideration.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot on the show about this idea of breaking free of the matchy, which I essentially define as, hey, you're a supplement and you only want to advertise on health podcasts. And there's a lot of that happens out there, especially for first time advertisers, where they think, I'm this type of a product. Like, I think true crime, for instance, gets really left out in the cold often because brands are like, oh no, I don't want to advertise on that kind of a show. And they don't realize how many women are listening, right? So they're going for maybe the female lifestyle or the pop culture or the health and fitness, and they're missing true crime, and there's this rich audience. So I really, I think it's so important to look at the audience and look at who is listening and not always rely on content. On the flip side, I think that there is so much to be said for content. And as we kind of go down this path of scale, which is certainly important, I do think that sometimes we leave the content piece out. And I've had the opportunity over the last couple of weeks to dive deeper into your content at Airwave. And I just think the history piece in and of itself is so fascinating because in my mind, when I think about a history podcast, I think about, a middle-aged white man, and that's the kind of history that
Right.
we're going to have, right? And yet there is so much diversity even within that genre when you've got a different creator of, maybe a different ethnicity or a different gender or a different age. I mean, all of those things are going to really impact the type of the content that you're creating. And that also means that every history podcast isn't necessarily a middle-aged man, right? There are lots of
Right.
different consumers of that. But as a brand, I think it's so valuable to look at how you're positioning yourself next to this content, because by aligning with that content, it really is amplifying kind of the voice and the message that a brand is trying to get out. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Within the history space, we're always trying to get beyond the kind of traditional idea of what, say, a history channel viewer
Right.
is.
Yes.
An old white guy who's obsessed with World War II.
Yes.
I think we have a lot of history podcasts that are very popular that are female hosts, and they do extremely well, and they bring something entirely to the different to the table. In some cases, it's a more looser format. It's more of a looser format than you might get with kind of a traditional male history host. We have a show called Queens, which is a gay man and a woman, and they basically drink and talk about history, talk about some famous woman in history. And they
Hmm.
have a custom cocktail that they do for each episode to go with the subject. It's a different approach and it's a lot of fun. So, yeah, I definitely think that history can be a lot of different things to different people. We're definitely seeing more diversity in the history space, which is great.
Hmm.
Shows like our show Redacted History by Andre White is a good example of that, really delving into overlooked stories and histories in history about groups that maybe didn't make it into the history books, whether it's Native Americans or Black Americans, Asian Americans, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really fascinating. So, when you think about a brand considering the content that they're going to advertise on, what would you say are some things that they should be looking for? I mean, are we looking for total alignment? Are we looking for the type of, you know, buyer that maybe that brand would want to reach? Like what are some aspects that brands should consider?
I think it's a mix. Of course, you want to consider the audience demographic. I think you want to consider how your brand fits with the content type. Yeah, perhaps some advertisers don't always consider that. I think for an advertiser, thinking about how that content reflects on you is another important factor that sometimes doesn't make it into the equation. Is that content controversial? Do you have to worry that the host may say something that might get your brand in trouble or lead to a boycott? So and I know that brand safety is always a concern for advertisers, but sometimes I think advertisers don't think about it in a wise way, for lack of a better way to explain it. They look for content that is purely a demographic alignment,
Hmm.
and they don't consider, oh, well, this host is a little bit of a wingnut and might say some things that could get us in trouble. And we've been in those positions before where we've had someone who's no longer with the network said something on Twitter and brought the product that was a very good, reliable advertiser for them into their own controversy, which is, rule number one: never do anything that drags an advertiser who's paying you money into your own drama. And it was done in a kind of roundabout way. But yeah, the other thing that I think advertisers sometimes don't consider is the host. And I know
Hmm.
it's hard as someone in the ad sales side to actually have those conversations. Perhaps, you want to streamline the process with a buyer and make it as efficient as possible. But yeah, some hosts are really, really great at ads and some aren't as great at ads.
Hmm.
And I think a host who will really go to the mats for an advertiser and personalize it and knows how to craft an ad that appeals to their audience is invaluable. But a lot of times it's hard to bring that into the conversation when
Right.
you're trying to streamline the process with the buyer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. You mentioned brand safety, and obviously that's such a huge issue for everyone across the board, right? And as you're talking about scale, as you're talking about potentially advertising on thousands of different podcasts, it's difficult to know exactly which podcast has content that's questionable or whether that host is maybe questionable. And as brands think about the type of content they want to align with, that can be a big project. So I know that the brand safety tools that have been created and are continuing to really be innovative have been a huge asset. What I don't think we talk about often enough is the opposite side of the equation, right? Which is, how is aligning with this content going to position your brand? And that there's a lot of power in that. And when I first got into this space about, 8 years ago now, there were a lot of conversations about that. And I think as the pendulum has swung over toward the position of brand safety and making sure that a brand is being preserved, which is super important, we've really lost sight of how much amazing content there is out there that is that lifelong learning, inspirational, just content where it's just so powerful to be positioned there. And also it's really powerful to be in front of that audience. And I don't think that we talk about that enough, that host read ad in particular being positioned next to powerful content has the ability to do a lot for a brand.
Absolutely. And I will say this about some of these brand safety tools that exist right now. Some of them tend to be a bit of a blunt instrument. We have podcasts that have sort of gotten ruled out or
Mm,
branded or are tagged as not brand safe because, say, it's a history show that deals with World War II, or you're dealing with controversial subjects in history, or just war in general, can get them flagged as not being brand safe in some of these tools. And we've had to then go to those tools, go to the people who run them and say, well, how are we defining brand safety here? We can't change history. We don't
right.
have any control over that. For instance, the Civil War is a fact, slavery is a fact. Just because we're discussing it on a smart intellectual history show doesn't mean that we are somehow courting controversy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's so important to think about. Now, we've talked a little bit about the host read ad and the power that is there as we are seeing expansion in the space. Certainly we're hearing many more announcer read ads, which I have to say, I was listening this weekend. I don't remember which show it was I was listening to, but they just did such a great job. I feel like announcer read ads just are continuing to do much better about saying this podcast is brought to you by this brand. And, if I were going to run an announcer read ad, that's how I would do it, right? Because the minute that you hear that this podcast is brought to you by this company, automatically you think, oh, this company is supporting this show, which is really powerful. But from an advertiser's perspective, what are your thoughts about the differences between a host read and a producer read? Like, where is the line there in terms of maybe effectiveness or leveraging that content? Is one going to be more powerful than the other?
It depends on the advertiser's goals, I suppose.
Mhm.
For a direct response advertiser in the traditional sense, post-read ads are still the gold standard from what I can tell. You want them to personalize it. They know their audience and they know the best way to present your product to them.
Mhm.
So I think in the traditional DR campaigns, yes, it makes a lot of sense. The more you see brands entering the podcast space, big name Fortune 500 companies, the more you may see advertisers who want to control the message a little bit more. They're very much used to TV ads, radio
Mhm.
ads, where they pre-produce an ad and they know that it's going to deliver each time, and they know that they're not going to have any issues or have to get a make good out of someone if they didn't like the read. So certainly as brands become a bigger and bigger piece of the pie, I can definitely see that happening. I can see announcer read ads becoming a bigger piece, even in direct sold
Mhm.
campaigns.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We are seeing a lot of integration in campaigns now where it's not just the podcast, but it's the social, it's the newsletter, it's the YouTube. What are you seeing in terms of that integration piece? And I guess I'm curious what content creators are actually creating.
The content creators that we work with tend to be mostly primarily focused on podcasts, although we
Mhm.
do have YouTube content as well. In some cases, that's standalone YouTube content, and in some cases, they are putting out the podcast to YouTube as well. Yeah, it all depends on the creator. Some of them are very focused on growing their brand on social media and newsletter and covering all their bases. For others, you know, they can barely keep up with the schedule of getting a podcast out once a week. So, social media and everything else is a little bit of an afterthought. Some will have more to bring to the table in terms of added value, whether it's social media, newsletters, or whatever. And some may have a gigantic podcast audience, but they just don't spend a lot of time cultivating their Twitter following, their
Mhm.
Instagram follower.
Yeah, yeah. I find it so fascinating because it seems like there are like there's this big kind of convergence happening, right? So it's like you have these, like traditional influencers who maybe have a big presence on social media who all of a sudden are like, "Hey, I should have a podcast." And then you have advertisers that are saying, "Hey, we'd really love more integration." And so now we've got these podcasters that are saying, let's maybe jump into social media. Obviously, I feel like YouTube has been a huge topic for quite a long time now. That desire for simulcasted content is really increased. Also, just the idea of standalone YouTube content that is still kind of that in that gray space of being a podcast, even though it's just a video. So it's like all of these different pieces coming together, but I do have to crack up a little bit when, when you say, some podcasters out there just getting a podcast done each week is all they can do, right? And I while I am excited about integrated campaigns and when we can find a content creator that has all of these different elements, we want to be able to take advantage of that. And I really do think that that's where we're moving. I also think in some ways there is a place for a podcaster just to be a podcaster. I think the real question is, do you do that anymore, right? Like, can you be just a podcaster and effectively create an audience, especially if you're getting started? What are your thoughts about that? And how have you maybe seen the way podcasting has changed throughout the years?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that you could launch a podcast and start to get some audience, and Apple might put you in the carousel for weeks, maybe even a month. It's harder and harder, even with a network backing you, to launch a podcast and to break into that top carousel or even the new and noteworthy. I think if you're a person who's starting out with the idea of I'm going to build my social media and all this other stuff and then use that as a way to launch my podcast, a lot of times that's a recipe for failure. That I always say to people, even when they're considering getting into YouTube, I said, that's fine, but don't let it distract from the main thing, which is your podcast, because it's
Mhm.
going to take a long time to build that YouTube audience. But, I'll take someone who has a passion for a particular subject and really loves what they're doing and maybe didn't think of it as a business when they first launched. They just
Mhm.
really loved something and wanted to talk about it and share it
Mhm.
with the world. I'll take someone like that over someone who is an influencer who just sees this as another component of their revenue strategy any day of the week.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. I think that that's such a great perspective because I do think ultimately it's about that authenticity. And I feel like we as a listener and as an audience, that comes across in the content that's being created. And if it feels like it's just a check mark, like, okay, did that move on to the next bit of content I'm creating? It doesn't come across as maybe as authentic, and ultimately it just doesn't create as good a content. So I think that that's a really important perspective.
I will say this, I do think that you will get more podcasters focusing more on the other stuff, for lack of a better word, the social media, on newsletters and everything else, if they start to see monetization involved in it. I think the problem up till now has been that the advertising industry has looked at social media and everything else as added value. So, okay, we'll do a podcast ad, but can you throw in an Instagram post? I think if they're actually finding ways to, how do I put this? I think if they're finding ways to put an actual price on those other things, then you will see people start to actually build up their social media and see some kind of value in working on the stuff beyond just the podcast.
Right, right. No, I think that that's a really good point. And I will say we definitely are seeing advertisers that are willing to pay for social and for more integrated campaigns. The problem is that there is a tipping point, right? So it's like you really have to amass a big enough following for someone to want to pay for it. And unfortunately, that, 0 to 100,000 or 500,000, right? I mean, it takes a long time to get there as, someone on social media or somebody in YouTube. And so it can be tricky. And I am with you 100%. If as a content creator, you're only able to create one thing really well, do that. It is much better to create one thing really well than like, 3 or 5 things where they're all just, pretty mediocre. So if you can, do one thing well, let's do that first and then we'll branch out.
Sometimes podcasters, once they start to earn some actual ad revenue from the podcast, they will reinvest that and get someone to handle social media and that kind of thing. We've
Right,
seen that a
right.
number.
Which I don't know how anyone out there in the social media world, unless it literally is your full-time job. I mean, most everyone has some sort of support in helping them to create a social presence because it's a lot of work.
It is. It's a
So,
big beast to feed
yeah,
every single day.
yeah, it really is. So, in terms of kind of where we're headed as an industry, what are your thoughts about where podcasts are headed?
I think there's a lot of talk over what defines a podcast these
Mhm.
days. And I know you just did an episode on that. I think we run into a certain danger of narrowly defining what a podcast is. If it has to have an RSS feed, if it's audio only, I think expanding into YouTube and other mediums out there makes sense. I think we're still a relatively young industry. So I think defining podcasts however you want is fine. If we want to say a podcast can have video, then why not? If we want
Mhm.
to consider TikTok a podcast, why not? I think we run into a danger of being so precious about what a podcast is that we define it so narrowly that it becomes too limiting for the industry. But I think the sky's the limit. The thing that keeps me up at night is thinking about what will be the podcast killer. And if there's something out there in the future. And I say that to my friends all the time in the industry. What is the next podcast killer? And nobody, or the podcast killer, if there is one out there, maybe it's YouTube, maybe it's something that we haven't even considered. But I think always thinking forward to what might be the competing medium in this day and age that just comes out of nowhere is always something that should be front of mind.
No, I love that. I would say that you may be one of the first people who have said that, but I'm right there with you. I think that it's something we don't talk about enough. As you have mentioned, the industry is still so young and it feels weird to say it's young because it's 20 years old, but really when you talk about it from a monetization perspective, it's relatively young. And I don't think that it would be totally unheard of for it to potentially get, like, killed by something, right? And obviously AI is huge in so many ways, and I think AI is gonna be kill a lot of industries in, the years to come. The question I have, and I think everyone has, is can AI kill podcasts? And I've had conversations with many people about this idea of generating content using AI. And what I get back to is that ultimately, how many of us really want to listen to computers, essentially talk to themselves, right? And the hope is that there's enough character and charisma in a human being that you wouldn't find in a computer that even if you were to say, okay, like, create a podcast for me about the Civil War, that they wouldn't have the ability to humanize it to a point that is something you would really want to listen to. I hope that if we get to a place where we have so much content that is all AI generated, that we'll have some sort of, the need to mark that as AI generated content. I would love to see that happen so that we're not, I mean, because for sure we'll get to a place where it might be difficult to differentiate I mean, gosh, the voice AI out there is so advanced now. that I think it would be really important for us to be able to mark that. So as consumers, we could say, oh, was this created entirely by AI, or was there an actual human being that was here? And so, I think that that's really important. I think that's important for everyone in the world, really, to look at how
Yeah.
AI is going to be interacting with what we're creating. But I also think that in the short term, YouTube is the piece that worries me the most, because as much as YouTube has helped in some ways to prop podcasts up, and so many people are listening to podcasts on YouTube, my concern is that we're going to get to a place where there is not a differentiator between a YouTube channel and a podcast. And then are we all just one big, conglomerate of content, and there isn't that differentiation? So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Right. Right. And there's always the potential down the road for either YouTube to swallow up podcasting, or podcasting, well, probably not to swallow up video, but we see Spotify making moves in video to challenge YouTube's dominance. But yeah, I do think it's a valid concern.
Mhm.
I definitely do. And as far as AI, AI is great at regurgitating information. Yeah, but you're not going to have, at least as far as I've seen so far, you're not going to have AI that can create an original thought or
Mhm.
original analysis. It's really just kind of just scrolling the internet looking for information, and it might repeat someone else's analysis of something, but it's not having an original thought. And I think people who listen to podcasts, they have a connection to the host, and I don't think AI works for most podcasts. AI probably works for if you have a daily podcast that is a summary of news for
For
the past 24
Mhm.
hours. I can certainly see how AI would work for something like that,
Mhm.
but you're never going to get an authentic relationship with the host, which I think is key to
Mhm.
podcasting.
Mhm.
People want to have a personal relationship with the host. They want to feel that they know that person, and they know what that person did over the weekend and so on. You're never going to get that with AI.
Right, right. No, for sure. And my hope too, it sounds like you're a real audio fan, and I know I am. Of course, I love video and film, and there's so much to be had there, but I just love audio. And for me, just consuming pure audio is where it's at. And so I really hope that that doesn't go away, and I don't think it will. I think that there's enough of a demand for pure audio that that's going to sustain. And I think it's just keeping an eye out on the way that it morphs, or the way that it changes. So we'll have to wait and see what happens.
I guess so. It is amazing that we have come back to audio after decades and decades of
It
television
is.
film. I mean, my dad's generation used to listen to the Lone Ranger on the radio, and The
Yeah.
Shadow, and all these great radio dramas. And it's amazing that people have discovered that again, listening to audio drama or nonfiction narrative podcasts. Yeah, it's interesting how it came full circle after
Yeah,
all those
yeah.
years.
I know, it's true. There's just so much power of the theater of the mind, and that's why I think it's also really effective for advertising. So, yeah, for sure. Well, Ben, before we go, I'm really excited because we at True Native Media have partnered with Airwave to help with the monetization of many of your shows. And so as I had alluded to earlier in the episode, I have spent so much time with your roster over the last couple of weeks, and really just gotten to know the shows in such an intimate way. And we're just really excited. You have amassed some really terrific content, and you have a lot of just terrific content creators. So we're really pleased to be able to help in the monetization efforts of those shows. And it's exciting to know that there is just really so much good content out there that is yearning for that right advertising partnership. And we know that those are out there.
Definitely, and we're excited to work with you. You have just a fantastic reputation, and all of True Native does. Over the years, we've talked with podcasters who were at True Native, and we tried to lure them away, and they said that we're so happy at True Native. I can't imagine anyone delivering better. Or we've had podcasts that used to be with True Native who would come over to us and talk about how great you were at ad sales and what a pleasure you were to work with. So, and your whole team. So we're really excited to be working with True Native. You have an impeccable reputation in this business. You are known for delivering both for the podcasters and for the advertisers. So we see it as a really great fit and we're excited.
Excellent. We are too. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Ben. I really appreciate learning a little bit about your history as well as your take on content within the podcast space. If people want to connect with you, where's a good place for them to find you?
Our website, airwavemedia.com, or on social media at Airwave Podcasts.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
All right. Thank you, Heather. It was great.
Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have. If you would like video and not just audio, please do feel free to head on over to my YouTube channel and check out this interview there. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.